Hello and good morning on the East Coast. Good afternoon, good evening around the world. Welcome to the Get Ready to Upgrade to BI 4.3. We are looking forward to sharing a ton of really good content around not only what's coming in 4.3, but that's less of a focus. What we really want to get to are the meat and potatoes of what should you be doing to get yourself prepared and to smooth that transition when you get ready to go. So today, I cannot tell you how excited I am to be joined by the Senior Director of BI and Analytics Practice at Enowa, Jonathan Hahn. And of course, my name's Nathan Crook. I'm a Senior Director here with 360 Suite. So the reason why I'm so excited about having Jonathan in is because honestly, I've looked up to him for a long time, and it's because he's been working in the BusinessObjects platform since it was basically Seagate. Author of 5 different books on topics from BusinessObjects to HANA. So we've got the right team here to really deliver a ton of value. So without further ado on the introductions, I want to get some housekeeping out of the way. On the right, I already see someone is bringing in questions, but there's a questions area. We're going to be taking your questions all the way through. We've got a Q&A section of the presentation because there's a lot of content that we'll get to towards the end, but we'll try to answer as much as we can along the way in terms of in the platform. So make sure you stay queued into that. Also, the session is being recorded, so you will get a copy of this recording. And if you're listening after the fact, welcome. Thank you so much for signing up. And then finally, there's an exit survey to help us get better. So we're on a mission to always continuously be getting better. Help us do so. Let us know if we can do anything to make this more valuable in the future. So with that, I want to move into some content. So Jonathan, why don't we tackle some agenda and get into the meat and potatoes?
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. Looking forward to getting into all of the detail, which there is a lot of detail, as Nathan mentioned. The agenda for today is going to start with some of the new features in BusinessObjects 4.3. Now, this webinar is not about that. 360 Suite's already done a good webinar. There's a couple of them that have been presented at conferences. Just kind of going to go through some of the highlights. What I want to focus more on is what are the common migration paths when it comes time for you to implement 4.3. Now, 4.3 is not GA. I already saw that question pop in. End of this year, first of next year is about when you're going to start seeing that show up. That's what we've been told. So look for it. So after that, I also want to talk about some basic housekeeping, like, how do we archive obsolete content? Why is that so important from both a migration and an ongoing platform stability standpoint? And then touch on a couple of security model features that, I've sometimes don't see clients adopting these yet. And so they've been around for a while. So I was going to touch on those, kind of a little bit of a knowledge share session there around a couple of those features. And then throughout, we're going to talk, Nathan will pipe in and he'll talk about some specific ways that 360 Suite, which is an amazing plugin that you can get, or a platform that you can get as an add-on to BusinessObjects to help with all kinds of administration needs. We'll address how some of the 360 Suite features can help throughout a lot of the challenges that sometimes are presented with getting ready for a migration. So we've got some polling questions. Nathan, I don't know if you wanted to run the polling questions here, but
gotcha. Go ahead and put that up for everybody. So what is your current BusinessObjects version? And we've got a few. We tried to split it up. It seems like a lot of people have made the move into the 4.x territory. So if you, for some reason, are 4.0 or older, go ahead and place in the questions what version you're on. And I'll be curious to understand what's holding you into that version as well. I don't know if you care to share, but it'll be interesting for the audience as well. So we're coming up on this great engagement too. We've got over 70% now. So I'm going to make these quick because, like I said, we've got a ton of content. I'm going to go ahead and pull this down and share. So 0% at 4.0 and older. So like I said, we had 3.1 in the answers and felt, you know what, most people have moved. And a majority in SP7. How about that? At least that answered. So cool. This really gives some perspective. Any thoughts?
No, I think that's surprising. Well, maybe not too surprising, but it is good to see that everyone's at least on 4.2, 13% at 4.1 of the attendees today. So
Yeah,
I think
sure.
it's good to keep that in mind as we go through the content and some of the recommendations. So
Yeah,
let's
sure.
look at the new features here. We're going to kind of go through this quickly, but I guess the overarching feature set of 4.3 is really the tighter integration between on-premise business objects and the SAP Analytics Cloud platform. And so up until this point, they've been kind of loosely coupled. What we're going to see in 4.3 is a real concerted effort to help make those two platforms work together a variety of ways, whether that's using web intelligence as a data source or user provisioning between the two. The other key feature here, which you've already kind of seen probably in 4.2 support pack 6 and 7, is the new Fiori style BI Launchpad and web intelligence viewing and editing interface. You've already seen a glimpse of that. That will become the standard in 4.3 though. And so, a very modern user interface that's going to work across all devices, whether that's PC or mobile phone or tablet. A lot of enterprise readiness enhancements to help you deploy the latest versions, comply with the latest security standards, etc. So live connectivity to universes back there on the far left side. Web intelligence documents as a data source, we've been told, will be a capability of that. So if you've got a lot of logic, variables, etc., already built into your web intelligence reports, and you don't want to have to redo that in the data model on the SAC platform, you can actually just leverage your existing web intelligence documents to do, for rapid deployment type scenarios and situations.
I think it's going to be huge.
Yeah, I think definitely help with adoption. User provisioning across cloud and on-premise platforms. It'll help tighter integrations. Basically being able to have users automatically show up in the SAC based on the on-premise business objects configuration. And then the Analytics Hub, which is kind of a BI launchpad-ish type cloud area, will allow you to have both SAC and business objects content there together in one user interface. From a user experience, we've already talked about the Fiori style, which just basically means HTML5 style interfaces for both web intelligence and the BI Launchpad. And then there'll be some other enhancements to, web intelligence as a data model. We already mentioned that. From an enterprise readiness standpoint, so we've been told there will be some enhancements to scheduling and publishing, installation and deployment maintenance. For those of you that have dealt with the installation cache growing exponentially with each patch, there's now going to be utility, we've been told, to help us take care of that cache without having to do uninstall. So that'll be, welcomed to see. In better compliance with modern securities, which I imagine means, Tomcat's up to date. And other things, security flaws or patches, etc., within all the different components of the platform. And then, of course, compatibility with modern data sources, both web-based, cloud-based, on-premise based, and modern OS support. And we've been also told, although we don't have a lot of details, on improved infrastructure as a service, so your AWS and Azure. There'll be a lot of additional features there to help automate certain tasks within that type of platform or cloud-based platform. All right, so another polling question here, Nathan.
Yeah, so when are you planning to move to BusinessObjects 4.3? I know this may seem a little premature, but I'm sure that people are starting to think about it, at least in conversations I'm having. It's been interesting because the amount of people I feel have deployed the Fiori front end in SP4 or later in 4.2 versus the number of people that are getting ready to go to 4.3 is a pretty big gap. And I'm curious to see how the new, the new way that users are going to interact with the system, develop in the system, et cetera, since that's going to be the only way in, is going to play out across an education standpoint, a usage standpoint, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, those are big changes from a user standpoint. So I do expect that to be something that everyone's going to have to make as part of their upgrade plan, is that education component to get everyone ready for that new BI Launchpad and Web Intelligence interface.
Yeah, totally. So we've got a pretty good smattering here. It seems that I'm not planning to move at the moment is at the highest. Of those people that I'm not planning to move at the moment, where are you currently? Are you in the SP7 range? That'll be an interesting breakdown, but second half 2020, Q2 2020, I imagine that's probably when we'll see the generally available version. You know, they always like to release things around Sapphire, so we'll see how that plays out. Okay.
All right, well, let's get back to some of the content here. Common migration paths. For those of you that have been involved with a lot of different upgrades or installations, I don't think this is anything really new. But I did want to share, from an education standpoint, what are the two ways that you can get to BusinessObjects 4.3? And the terminology that SAP commonly uses is upgrade, and I added the migration because essentially, when we do an upgrade, we are moving content from one version to the other version. And there'll be a separate CMS repository and FRS repository, a separate installation. So two independent environments, and then there's some tool that we use to migrate content from one to the other. And we'll go through all the pros and cons of that approach here in the next few slides. The other option, which will be fully supported from what we know to this point, is going from any version 4.x to 4.3 in place. And so this is essentially where you just take your existing platform and then you go through the installation and update in place to 4.3. So, there's going to be pros and cons there as well that we'll discuss in the next few slides. So let's talk about what is an upgrade with migration in a little bit more detail. Again, separate CMS and FRS. There's an upgrade management tool that's provided out of the box, but this really is only something that you can use if you're going from the 3.x or earlier. And from our polling questions, it seems like most of you aren't there. So, it will support, just like all previous versions of BusinessObjects, going from some of the older versions to the new versions. And so when I say older versions, I'm talking about everything before .4.x. The upgrade management tool, was a replacement for the import wizard starting with 4.x. That's a piece of software. It has gotten better with every release. We expect it to have some improvements with 4.3, although those have not been released yet. So when you've got a legacy version, essentially you've got a few upgrade paths. If you're on anything before 4.3 or XIR2 support pack 2, you have to first go to XIR2 support pack 2. Again, our polling question basically told me most of you don't have to even worry about this. The other option, if you are on 4.x to go to 4.3 and you do want to do a migration or an upgrade with migration, you're going to be looking at using the promotion management tool if your only option is out of the box tools. Now there's a GUI base of that runs inside of the central management console. There's also a command line version of that. I'm referring to both as an option here. But if you've ever done promotion management tool with lots of objects, you know that sometimes that can be a challenge. There is another more advanced option that I've had to use with larger repositories, which is essentially clone the original environment that's 4.x into a new environment that's running on an updated server, whether that's OS, database, etc. So you use database tools to migrate the database. You copy the files in the FRS. You start with the same version of binaries that you currently have, and then you do an in-place upgrade. So This is really something you have to do if you're wanting to get on to new hardware, new OS, new platform, and you have an extremely large repository. So, 500,000 objects, or maybe a little bit less than that, but definitely more than that. You definitely are probably looking at an option like this. Unless you've got tools like 360 Suite offers that Nathan will talk to about here in just a minute. So what are the pros and cons of the upgrade with migration option as it relates to 4.3? Well, I think first and foremost, it does give you the opportunity to clean up content, but that is not an option if you're using that more advanced option 2 I just discussed. So full disclosure there. Commonly, we find that a lot of business objects environments are overburdened with obsolete content, undocumented security, proliferated user content in the user folders and inboxes, and like scheduled instances or unused reports. So this is definitely an opportunity to kind of clean up. The reason why is because you can just choose not to migrate content with the promotion management tool or the upgrade management tool. Another good pro here is that generally by the time we get to the next release of business objects, it's a good time to upgrade our OS and hardware. So this is the safest way to do that. There's no in place, which adds a little bit of risk there, because if something goes wrong, then you're going to have to fall back and recover the environment. With this, it's 2 separate environments. You can kind of move over incrementally. You can do a lot of testing, and then you can have a switch over weekend and a final incremental pull of some of the content. If you do have a lot of platform add-ons, it's the evolution of 4.x. There's been a lot of add-ons like Design Studio, Lumira, Explorer, and to name a few others. But at some point those tools have kind of fallen to the wayside. They're not going to be available in 4.3 in some cases, and so this is a good opportunity, good way to just not migrate that content. And on your new target environment, simply do not install those plugins, and they'll be completely gone from the environment. Again, option 2 does not have this benefit. So that option 2 is really an extreme case. So what are some of the downsides to this? Well, it's a lot more human resource intensive, because you're going to have to do promotions and testing for one. If you've got really large repositories, this can take a lot of time. That's been my experience. You have to do lots of incremental, or you have to do like our option 2 extreme case there. The other thing is, when I've already kind of mentioned this, when you go 4.x to 4.x, the upgrade management tool does not work for source and target. You have to use the promotion management tool, and the GUI, especially around that, has some limitations about how many objects you can move at one time. So you got to be very careful with that. You got to plan for that accordingly, and understand that that's going to take more time compared to doing an in-place upgrade, for example. And the other thing too to remember is that there's some settings that are outside of the CMS, like your Tomcat settings or your other web application server. All that stuff has to be manually re-implemented when you go this migration path. So those are some things to keep in mind if you're going to go this route. So what are some of the best practices here? Well, before we do an upgrade with migration, I always say clean up content. Do the best you can to clean up content. That will reduce the amount of info objects you actually have to promote or migrate. Always check your source CMS for corruption. This was with the upgrade management tool especially, this was a big necessity to go through and make sure you didn't have any orphan FRS content. A lot of those would halt the UMT tool in its place. Can also be problematic for the promotion management tool. So always check your source system for corruption. I put an SAP note or 2 up there that you can go in and kind of get some information on how to run the repository diagnostics tool. If you have a very large repository, try to do incremental migrations to reduce the size of one individual batch. The magic number there depends on a lot of factors, so I'm not going to give you a magic number, but let's say lots, meaning tens of thousands of objects at a time, or sometimes more than that is what I'm referring to. So keep in mind too that when you do an upgrade, there's sometimes or often new access control entries or ACEs. These are specific privileges that may be added or changed based on enhancements to the platform. Do your delta analysis there. Make sure that any of your custom access levels or advanced privileges are adjusted appropriately for that. So that requires some testing, usually in a sandbox environment, to kind of see what that delta is. One of the common mistakes I see is if you're using like LDAP, SAP, or other third-party authentication groups like Active Directory, move those groups over with the promotion management or the upgrade management tool so that you retain your QID. The other option is, of course, to configure it and then import them fresh into the new environment, but then that creates some problems from a promotion management standpoint. It is likely that you'll need to test your web intelligence reports going to 4.3. There is a new interface. There are some new capabilities. So remember, testing is probably going to be a big component of this. That's one of those labor-intensive tasks I was talking about. Your Tomcat settings I already mentioned. They're not moved over. In a migration scenario, you have to move those over manually. And be aware, especially if you're coming from 3.x to 4.x, the server sizing, the configurations of individual services or servers is very different in 4.x. You know, there could be some changes, especially to the adaptive processing server that you want to look for in 4.3. There could be new container services in there. There could be different memory requirements for 4.3 based on some changes to the platform. So be aware that you may have to tweak some of your sizing or completely do it differently if you're coming from 4. or 3.x. All right, Nathan, I'll turn that back over to you. So we talked about some of the pros and cons. What Nathan's going to go through, you know, several things here. What is their recommended process, and also share with you some of the ways that 360 Suite can help with a lot of the challenges I just presented.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, it's interesting because what you went through there in terms of specific to 4.3, you know, the reality is that a lot of us have dealt with this a number of times. Each time we've had a major release, or even the minor releases of the 4.x platform, have presented some of the same challenges you were talking about. You know, consuming a lot of human resource intensive time and work, the need to test, the need to understand sizing and how that's going to be different in terms of, you know, when we went from 64-bit, from 32 to 64-bit, you know, they're just, each time we've made big changes, it has lent itself to the reason why a lot of people leverage 360 Suite. And if you look in the bottom of the GoToWebinar control panel, some of you may have minimized it to the side with the little orange arrow. There's actually an upgrade checklist and a Work Smarter handout at the bottom that you'll see, 2 PDFs that you can download as a part of Complimentary Today to help on this. And so we've put together a best practices approach to managing your way from one version to another, no matter which version you're going to, but it's even more necessary in terms of moving into 4.3, because at some point you've got to prepare for this move. And so in order to do that, you need to understand and document how many instances of reports do I have out there? How much do I need to keep? How many reports do I have? Are they used? Are they not used? How many users do I have? Is it time to clean up my users? Make sure that my licensing is good in terms of my concurrency. Over time, am I growing the number of people using the content? All these types of questions are really pretty difficult to answer without something to help you in terms of gathering the data and exposing it so that you can easily get the answers. Backing up, as you mentioned, backing up and especially making changes. Corruption is a real challenge, and traditional backup methods don't lend themselves to easily coming back from that. You know, they always are going to take a pretty sincere amount of time, and this really smooths that process over, as well as helps with the, you know, if you've got a ton of content, the challenges that you'll have with the upgrade manager they, or the promotion manager, they really are taken care of with the promotion inside of our backup promotion being able to compare source and target, see what's changed or what's different if things aren't acting correctly. I mean, there's just a ton of capability there. Being able to clean up, the preparation stage should tell you what's not being used in the system, but then you've still got to go one at a time to go clean up that content. You can automate that process, or even just bulk handle that process. And then moving forward, as soon as you do clean up, things get dirty again, right? Users are going to continue to create content. Inboxes are going to continue to grow unless you have your settings set up where people don't use that sort of thing. So essentially, being able to automate and keep your system clean going forward is a huge advantage and prepares you already for the next time it's time to make a change. Now, there's obviously a number of steps here. I don't want to spend too much time going through each and every single one of these, but I think one of the largest ones I really want to pull out is the testing aspect. This is by and far the largest ROI event that most of my customers, celebrate or relish in terms of, when they turn around at the end of any of these types of events, whether it's, updating their OS or updating a major version or a minor version, or you're getting pushed content from an OEM provider like Epic or whomever, being able to test and ensure that your data is the same from the time before you made the change to the time after you made the change. And on top of that, that all of your graphs and your images and the structure of your reports and the runtime, if you're upgrading to a new database, you're hoping for some performance improvements. Well, being able to prove out that and document it is a huge win to show that IT is really providing value by maintaining their architecture and moving things forward from a security standpoint overall. So that in and of itself is a huge way to manage compliance efforts, manage user expectations, manage adoption, so people can trust and know that when they go in and they run their reports in the new version, that data from the system. So all of that said, I want to keep us moving. We'll come and touch on some pieces of this as we move along, but if we can, if you are interested at all in this, we have a full paper that's available. Reach out to us. We can more than happy to show you.
All right, so let's continue on. Back to the education portion of this, and let's take a look at the other option. Update is basically an in-place upgrade, going from 4.2 support pack 6, for example, to 4.3 by downloading the media and doing the install. This is by far the easiest option, I think, for most organizations, but there are a number of factors we have to consider before we celebrate, as you can see people are doing there in the pictures. It's not always going to be this easy. There's some things that we need to think about, some things that we need to discuss before we start, going down this route full force. For example, I put in here, if you're on 4.0 support pack 5, you may not want to do an in-place upgrade to 4.3 support pack 0. So, pros and cons again. This is obviously the quickest path because you don't have to do all the reconfiguration. The cleanup isn't that as important because we're not actually moving content from one repository to the next. But there are some things that you need to consider. First of all, what is your current version? The older you are in your 4.x platform, the more you may want to consider actually doing a migration. So, I have in numerous occasions going from one version to the next to 4.x. Over the last few years, I've had some technical issues. And those aren't fun when that happens because you're kind of stuck in an in-between state and have to roll back, or you have to just kind of figure out how to get through it. So, the older you are, the more likely I expect that to be. Now, obviously, I don't have the 4.3 installation media, so I haven't actually tested this, but I'm just basing this on past experience. The other thing is your supported platforms. If you're on an older operating system in CMS Database, those may not be supported going to 4.3. So That may be a showstopper for doing an in-place upgrade on its own. You know, there may be ways around that you can continue down that path, but none of them are really clean, and a lot of them introduce a lot of risk. So, you know, if you're on an older version of 4.x and you've got an old OS or CMS database, this is maybe a good time to go ahead and get everything up to date and migrate content over. Add-ons and plugins is another thing to consider. We mentioned Lumira Studio, Design Studio, Explore, Analysis for Office. There's a whole bunch of plugins that you can get. You may not want them going forward. The future is really with SAP Analytics Cloud with a lot of those things. And so this is, if you do an in-place upgrade, you also have to upgrade those plugins. And so some of those aren't even available with 4.3, like Explorer, for example. I know from what I've heard, that's not even going to be an option. So
Right.
it's a good time to kind of get away from that and do a migration without doing an in-place upgrade.
Totally. And you know, there's an offer from SAP right now that you can right size your business objects landscape. You know, if you're not using all the users that you've purchased for that, to get SAC, a really easy, no cost way of getting into that, you know, I don't know if everybody knows that, and I'm not trying to sell SAP, obviously. But at the end of the day, you know, it's a great way to get in and make sure that you're leveraging your investments wisely with SAP.
Yeah, and that's a good point, is talk to your account rep about those types of opportunities and options is another thing that I didn't really bullet point out in here, but it is another thing that you probably want to do in preparation for going to 4.3. All right, so let's get technical here for a second. What are some prerequisites that we need to do before we do an in-place upgrade? First of all, maybe you already know this, but there is an inventory.txt file that you can get to on Windows, especially, that has a history of everything you've ever installed. So take a look at that. Make sure you do an inventory of your inventory.txt file, because that will list out all the plugins, all the versions, patches, etc., that you've installed. So that's a good place to start. Again, on all of the compatible packages for each plugin, you know, you got to have those. If they are being removed, you've got to address that as well. You know, one of the more painful aspects of doing an upgrade in the past was, you know, that this multi-step kind of methodology we had to take, where we first went to the support pack, then we went to the latest patch. So the good news is going forward, that's not an issue. So starting with 4.2 support pack 6, this has actually already been out, and it will continue with 4.3 as this new one installer package. I have used them, they're great. Essentially, you can go directly from your current version to the latest support pack and patch version in a single step. It's a new installation package. It will have one installer in the name. That's how you kind of distinguish it from the other. Put the SAP note here that you can go look at to get more information on that, but it will simplify the installation process. That's not unique to 4.3. You can use that today if you're on support pack 6 patch 100 or higher. If you're going to support pack 6 patch 100 or higher, let me rephrase that, you can use it. There was a kind of a lingering issue out there if you're on Windows, not a problem if you're on Linux, but they changed the Windows installer version, compiler version at some point in 4.2 support pack 4. It can actually have some problems with the plugins and the ability to use the uninstall, add and remove programs feature of Windows with business objects, which could be problematic. If you do an in-place upgrade and you're kind of on 4.2 support pack 4 or before that, you definitely may want to consider going to the migration option because of that issue alone if you have plugins. So I've got my blog posting out there. I wrote on this a long time ago. There's also a knowledge base note about it. So be cautious if you're going to do the update in place and you're on 4.2 support pack 4 or before. You may have some problems if you're on Windows. So best practices, again, like we did with the migration. If you're going to do an in-place upgrade, absolutely make sure you got a backup rollback plan of your database, your FRS. 360 Suite has some great backup tools as well that Nathan can talk to when I get through this list. The other thing seems kind of common sense, but I can't tell you how many times I've had a problem with doing an in-place upgrade when I forgot to reboot the system. Sometimes these systems run for years without reboots. So I always recommend that you do a full reboot, flush everything out of the OS, and then when you bring it back up, when you start the in-place upgrade, shut down all your BOBJ services except for the CMS, FRS, and Tomcat. And if I actually use Process Explorer, which is a sysinternals utility that you can use to look at actual processes on your operating system, I bring that up during the upgrade and just kind of monitor it, look for, make sure you don't have orphan PIDs. Sometimes that happens when you stop BOBJ services for some reason. If those files are in use when it's trying to do the upgrade, sometimes it halts the upgrade in place. So, get your slate as clean as possible when it comes to business objects processes, and get yourself a way to monitor that during the upgrade process. I guess I hate to say that this is little known, but I've been using this for years. But essentially, the way Tomcat does new war files is it first unpacks them into a directory that's under the Business Objects Enterprise XI 4.0 war files directory. And then it actually deploys them to its runtime location, which is the typical Tomcat web apps folder. So if you've got any WebImp custom config files, you need to copy them here first to the unpack directory, so that when it does the new war file deployment with the upgrade, it will push them back out to the runtime spot. Just some things to do to make your life easier there when it comes to customizations for Tomcat, which, that's where a lot of your single sign-on and a few other things are located. So don't forget about that. Again, your operating system and your database have to be supported. Don't forget about that. Make sure you check the PAM before you do an in-place upgrade. Make sure your operating system, if it is supported, has the latest OS patches. There's a knowledge base out there that I've listed for Windows and Linux that kind of tells you what you need to be at, as well for the .NET framework. So take a look at those notes before you do an in-place upgrade. I already talked about the database being supported. And again, we talked about backup at the very beginning of this bullet point, and at the very end, make sure you have a fallback plan in place in case the in-place upgrade fails. So before we get to the polling question, Nathan, do you have anything you wanted to add from a 360 suite standpoint here?
I think you touched on it. Realistically, these best practices pretty well stand whether you're using 360 or not. So,
all right, so polling question.
Right, so we put this up here. Just curious on which way you're thinking of now that we've kind of dove into what an update versus upgrade migration. I'm sure you knew this going in, but maybe you haven't thought about it for 4.3. What would you what are you proposing or thinking of in terms of how you're going to move forward? I know a lot of time we've spent with the product managers of business objects have really said that SP4 and behind, you should really consider doing the upgrade with migration to simply clear out, or if you've done multiple updates, that clearing that off and getting a fresh install is a great way to go forward. So I'm going to close this and share. So most going upgrade migration. So I'm curious, in the questions area, if you were in the upgrade migration area, is this mainly for OS and database purposes? Is this or something else? And then of course, I'd like some advice to decide. I think that's a smart way to go. And then the 10 steps demo, of course, happy to do that for you. Thoughts?
All right. So a couple other things that I have in here to discuss, kind of some housekeeping things that are good. even if you're not doing an upgrade or a migration, it's just essentially understanding how Business Objects works when it relates to the CMS database and the FRS. So when you deploy Business Objects, of course, you always have a database and you also have a file repository. There's an input and an output location. And the combination of those two are really considered your repository. They work kind of hand in hand with each other. The database kind of contains all the metadata, so to speak, and the FRS contains the actual reports, whether that's the actual report you're viewing on demand or a scheduled instance. And the two work hand in hand, like I mentioned. Really every info object that you see in Business Objects, which is really just about everything, especially if you're in the CMC or the Beyond Launchpad, every folder, every user, every application, every report instance, they're all info objects, and each info object relates back to a record in the CMS database. So there is a direct relationship with the amount of content you have and the number of records that you end up with in your CMS database. Now, for most row store type databases, as we know, once you get the record volume to a certain limit, you have to have indexes to help speed up queries to that CMS database. And even then, at some point, you meet the limitations of your hardware pretty fast there as well too. So the more records that we have, once we get to a certain point, the slower our CMS queries get and the worse our user experience gets. Now generally depends on your database, how it's configured, what kind of hardware it has, where this breakpoint is. But when you start getting into the hundreds of thousands, closer to 1 million records in the CMS repository, things start to break down. I don't really see the FRS growth as an issue that nowadays. In the past, it was an issue when file systems weren't as robust as they are now. But with SSD and all these other things, having a large file allocation table used to be a problem. Not so much of a problem now, but nonetheless, especially if you're migrating, having a very large FRS, those are where your actual reports are. Those reports have data in them. They can be megabytes in size, 50, 20, 30 megabytes in size in some cases. So, that's another area where you have to kind of remember to kind of keep an eye on for normal maintenance purposes and for migration purposes. So what are the benefits of actually cleaning this up? So generally what I recommend is before you actually do a migration and upgrade, or even if you get to, once a year, twice a year maintenance cycle on your Business Objects environment, we do want to take some time to clean things up. So again, I mentioned the database. The more records, the more pressure that we put on the database to actually perform queries, and it can actually slow the system down over time. So do recommend that you have an archiving and purge strategy in place for routine maintenance. FRSs get too large, they can affect backup, disaster recovery, and other high availability options that you have in place. Again, another great area that goes hand in hand with the database, deleting obsolete report instances, for an example, user content and inbox and favorites that's no longer used. All of those things are good housekeeping. So it's always a good idea to review this, have a good handle on the number of info objects that you have. It's part of what I do in any of my scoping. That's the first question I usually ask is, how many info objects do you have? Because I need to kind of understand that, because I may recommend some cleanup before we do a migration, or if no cleanup is possible, it will impact the amount of time it takes to actually migrate, and at least my approach in some cases. And a two, I've already mentioned this a couple times, the upgrade management and performance management tool, start breaking down when you're moving 100,000, 200,000 plus info objects in a single batch. Nathan, do you have something you wanted to add here?
I was just thinking of, it's pretty funny. We were working with an edge install of Business Objects, and so for those of you in the parlance of SAP, it's considered a small system. Relatively few users, etc., and it's contained on one box. So anyways, we were plugging in our metadata, the metadata aspect of what we do into their system, and just doing some routine reports and looking, and all of a sudden the FRS reports on instances popped up with over 1 million instances in their database. And it turned out that there was something had broken schedules, and all of a sudden went rogue and created hundreds of thousands of instances of documents that nobody knew were out there. That you unpack these things, and all of a sudden you find something that that could be detrimental to you trying to do some sort of move like this to 4.3. So always good to keep an eye, and like you said, keep a process, even preferably automated, that maintains all of this in a healthy way for you.
All right, so next slide. Really just boiling down all those points into my recommendations, which is, hey, let's try to get rid of some content as much as possible. Nathan mentioned their 360 suite has an archiving solution, so it's a good way to get them out of the CMS and FRS without actually losing them, but getting them into another product or tool that doesn't, require frequent access. You can always restore them if you need them. And again, that's really because out of the box, archiving really is deleting, so that may not be the best option. So 360 Suite has some great tools to help you manage archiving in those scenarios. Again, the other thing too is just trying to determine what we can delete based on what's been accessed. It is possible with the query builder to kind of build a query to do that. That's probably not something every business objects administrator is going to know how to do. 360 Suite has some great tools to help us identify. They have a lot of metadata reporting capabilities to help you not only identify obsolete content, but then go back in mass and delete that content pretty quickly. So very outstanding alternative when managing large quantities of content. Nathan, do you want to add anything to that?
No, nothing specific. I think we've touched on it. But the reality is that all of this stuff is kind of left, to the point of when we get to this best practices in terms of getting ready to do something, being in front of it and making it so that it's easier automated is probably ideal. So, that's really the basis of why we do what we do. So brings us to a poll question. I'll go ahead and show that up since we're steadily moving through our time. So just curious, how do you currently keep your repository healthy? Is it a manual aspect for you? Do you use limit settings for instances, or do you even, I've seen environments where they prevent users from creating instances, or the we don't really perform any maintenance is always popular. And makes this aspect of moving even tougher. It just makes it more of a big event, I guess you could say. So just keep this open for just a second or two more. We still got people engaging.
So far, limit settings for instances is the most popular, which is good. I think that's a good way to keep that clean.
Absolutely. Right, so manually deleting obsolete content, that one, manual deletion. I'm curious, are you going in and doing queries with Query Builder to work that out, or how are you working that out? I prevent users from creating, of course, and we don't really perform any maintenance. It's 16%. Interesting. And I need help. No shame in raising your hand when you need help. So we can help you with that. I'm going to go ahead and hide these and keep us moving.
All right. So a couple other things I wanted to add this just from a security standpoint. I already mentioned that when you go to a new version, there's typically going to be a point where you've got some new access control entries. You'll have to make some adjustments to your security model to support those. You could be adding or removing plugins, which of course would orphan some of those ACEs. In that case, when you're moving over your custom access levels. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things that they've added a while back, but I'd say probably 50-50 whether the clients that I've worked with have actually adopted some of them. So here's another opportunity. You're going to 4.3. Let's take a look at our security model. So some legacy design practices like advanced rights and inherit from parent folder manipulations are specifically what I see often. The advanced rights is kind of where you get down to a folder or report or some other object, and you don't have an access level there that matches exactly what you do. So you go to the advanced rights and you start adding all kinds of ACEs there. Now those things end up living with that object, and they're not reusable across other objects. So you can get to quick inconsistencies within your security model using advanced rights. The other thing is the inheritance from parent folders, going in there and unchecking that at the object level as opposed to doing it at the access level, which is a new thing we'll talk about with scope of rights. The scope of rights was introduced in 3.x. It allowed you to, on a custom access level, or even with the advanced, which I just told you not to use, rights, go in there and manipulate how the ACEs would propagate from the object you applied it to all the way down to the child object. And so these are some things that you can take advantage of now is, being able to manipulate that within your access levels, your custom access levels specifically, which would be the best practice. But where would you use this? And I think there's a couple areas you would definitely use it, like the root of public folders, root of universes and connections, top level folders. I'll show you a couple of examples here in a second with custom access levels for hidden folders, as I like to call them in the public folder hierarchy. And I already mentioned that you may have obsolete access control entries because you're removing plugins or just functionality changes going to 4.3. So if you haven't adopted some of these modern techniques, especially with custom access levels, it may be difficult for you to go through and identify all this and fix all of this before you upgrade or migrate. So what are custom access levels? So out of the box, we've got a few that SAP provides to us, which is full control owner, schedule view, and view on demand. Lots of different ACEs packed into those. They're pretty self-explanatory, but obviously full control lets you do just about everything. Schedule limits you to just scheduling reports. View limits you to just view only on objects. View on demand allows you to refresh reports that are out in your public folders, for example. And of course, it varies depending on what kind of object you're applying to and what actually that means. So back in 3.x, we could actually create our own versions of these called custom access levels. You could go in and add all the ACE entries for them. Great add-on to business objects a while back because these are central and reusable. So if I created a custom view on demand and schedule combined together with some other custom access control entries and apply that to 1,000 folders. And if I needed to make an update to that, I could come to the custom access level, modify it, and it would automatically apply to all 1,000 folders. So great enhancement that they had a while back. I'd say probably 80% of clients I work with have already done this. There are a few holdovers that I've had in the last few years that are still using advanced rights, but definitely one of the things you want to discontinue. Moving to 4.3 is a good opportunity to go ahead and clean up your security model in that way. Scope of rights is another thing, and I put an image here in the slide. You may or may not have ever noticed this when you're building a custom access level or you're on the advanced rights tab, but there's two icons out there between grant, deny, and not specified for applying the privilege to the object and the child object. They're both checked by default, but you can actually manipulate those. And so just like you see in the image here, I've done on the view objects, I've just checked the object only and then told it not to apply that to all the child objects. Commonly, we use this on the root of public folders, connections, and universes, and a few other areas, because what it does is it essentially lets you in the front door, but you don't automatically get to see what's in the room, so to speak. And then you can go down to each top level public folder and apply a different access level, which would let you see that. So it simplifies a little bit of your administration. On the flip side, we can actually also use this to hide folders. Basically using the opposite checkbox combination where we don't apply it to the parent, but we do apply it to the child. So sub-objects only in that case. That way you can have hidden folders that people cannot see in the BI Launchpad, but if you have open doc links or other ways of getting to that content, they'll still be able to access it without seeing it, so to speak. So those are two use cases. There's probably others we could brainstorm on, but those are the two most common use cases. And so I really do recommend that. It really does simplify life when you use that, especially at the root folders or top level folders. And so the other part of this is, before we go to 4.3, and I'll let Nathan talk here in just a second, but really is, okay, so what if I'm using advanced rights? What if I've got a whole bunch of ACs that are obsolete? This is really tough to go through your system with the out-of-the-box tools and identify all that. So Nathan, why don't you talk to the group about how 360 Suite helps with this?
Right. This was actually where 360 came from, frankly. The very first aspect of what we developed was around security, because simply when we went to XIR3, the visibility and the ability to make changes became much more difficult, and prompted our founders to develop a solution where in this view is essentially the way that you can look at it in 360, is that it gives you a matrixed view of either end users or groups, however you want to look at it, or based on content, and make live changes in the system in bulk or one at a time, creating custom access levels. I mean, frankly, it gives you the ability to do anything you can do in the CMC through 360. Only you can document directly out of the system, and you can also affect change and see the change not only to your primary rights, but anything inherited. You can see the changes take place, document it. We've even got some public sector groups that automate the re-implementation of their security on a monthly basis to make sure that no changes have been made that weren't approved. So there's a lot of ways to make your life much easier from this aspect.
All right. Yeah, it's definitely, when I've used this in the past, it's definitely helped just to identify all kinds of different things that may be need adjustment, or advanced rights, for example, trying to find all of that. Very easy to use, very good layouts to help you visualize that as well. All right, so polling question.
Right, so in terms of security, when was the last time you looked at this? And have you put any of these topics into play? Taking advantage of custom access levels, scope of analysis settings, and is there anything that you can do or we can do to help you do that better? Frankly, we've still got some answers coming in. It's interesting, not being an administrator myself, I hadn't really, I didn't understand the differences between scope of analysis and really why that was important. So that's been an interesting takeaway for me. But of course,
yeah, it looks like the numbers are kind of lining up with what I've experienced as well. 60% yes, 33% partially, 10% no.
right. Yeah, for sure.
All right, we're about 2 minutes left and got a few
Rapidly
things to touch on, so
keep it moving.
Try to finish on time.
Right. There's just so much good stuff here.
Yeah, so key points. Let's kind of summarize this. What we learned today. Using the upgrade migration methodology when moving to 4.3 will give you the opportunity to clean up content. Someone asked a few questions, or at least made a comment about how that also clears up that installation patch cache. That's another good point that I didn't put in here, but it does also clean up that content as well, even though 4.3 has a tool to help you remove that. Maybe a little too late for a lot of us that they finally added that, but I'm glad that they finally did. Don't let your repository grow indefinitely. Make sure you have an archiving, deleting strategy, no matter what that is. A lot of you expressed that you use limits, manual deletion, or maybe 360 Suite has some functionality to help you. Security model, a lot of you are taking advantage of that already, which was great to see, but don't forget about that. Here's a good opportunity to go ahead and adopt some of those practices. And I think overall, we try to plug this in as many times as we could, how 360 Suite helps with a lot of the things that we listed out here in the presentation today. So a little self-promotion. I wanted to talk a minute about Enowa, and Nathan can follow up and talk, kind of give his conclusion on 360 Suite. But Enowa has been around for quite a while, since 2002. Core expertise in SAP ERP implementations and lots of other things that surround that. I run the data and analytics practice, so I'm 100 miles deep in SAP BI and all of the different tools and strategies that go along with that. But we also do things like Celonis, C for HANA, S for HANA, S for HANA Cloud as well. Working on, we've got a very strong technical team too. So if you need basis help, whether that's your SAP systems or your business object systems, Enowa can definitely help with all of those different things. We have a global presence around the world. We have helped lots of companies deploy systems in a global capacity. And that's what I'll say about Enowa. And then Nathan, I'll turn it over to you for a 360 suite.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched on a lot of this. Frankly, there's no aspect of managing, being a director or a C-level executive over analytics, or even really in the organization, down to the end user and analyst and the people creating content, that we can't help improve their life around business objects. Each of these are general areas where we've seen a tremendous amount of value delivered to customers. And if any of this is interesting, or you're just curious, feel free to let us know. There's obviously no pressure. You've obviously made a fair investment into business objects at this point. If you're coming on and looking at 4.3 and all of these things, there's no reason to not look at ways to do things smarter, not harder. So if we can be of help, let me know. To that end, I just wanted to launch the last poll. Are you going to be a tech ed this year? I'm curious to see if you're going to be there, if we can connect. We're doing a very cool party on Wednesday evening with the SAP Business Objects leadership. So the product management team will be attending, and if Sapphire is in any indication, when we did the same aspect at Sapphire, people found this to be their most valuable session, because it allowed them to ask those questions that are burning, that only SAP can answer. So make sure that if you're attending, and you raise your hand here and let us know. We're happy to provide an invitation. We'll have some nice music, some good food, some champagne, a classy event that gives access to analytics customers. So I'll close that and get us started to wrap up. I know we went through a ton of these questions. Was there anything that we needed to kind of clear up on from that standpoint?
No, I think I answered most of the questions. We had quite a few comments. I don't think we need to reply to those. One thing that someone did ask Tim Day about the queries of web service and whether or not that's still going to work for Excelsius dashboards. I honestly do not know. That's a good question. I haven't heard anything that says that it wouldn't work, but definitely when 4.3 documentation gets released later this year, that would be one of the first things I look at, so that I will know for sure whether or not that actually works. I do know that the future for Excelsius dashboards may not even be in 4.3. So, I'm not even sure if Excelsius is carried over. It may only be Design Studio. So, those are things SAP has to confirm. I don't know if you've heard, Nathan.
Yeah, I know that there was a roadmap presentation that they had that SAP presented with ASUG. Was it last week, I believe, where they were talking about how Explorer and Excelsius and all of even Design Studio, the designer piece, are all getting moved into SAP Analytics Cloud. Whether that content's going to be supported, I didn't gather it off of that presentation. But I know that ultimately, long term, that it is definitely not. And you know what? That's a great question. We talk with the team over there at SAP a tremendous amount. We work very closely to develop our solutions with them, so that anytime they change, we change. And that's one of the things about working with 360 is there's a lot of what we do that could probably be done in the SDK manually for your own purposes, but then it's got to be maintained. And anytime things change, you've got to change, you got to maintenance it, those people leave. It's just a challenge. And so that's really where we come in a large value, is that being able to help you maintain through change one of those funny things is that your auditor gets blown away anytime you do a major upgrade. We've got audit information from XIR2 in our demo systems all the way to 4.2. So anyways, really appreciate the time. Jonathan, this was awesome. You brought a ton of value to this presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and if you guys have some follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to Nathan or I. My Twitter handle, if you want to get me on Twitter, is @JDH2N. I can follow up with anything. I think we got some good follow-up questions ourselves, especially around Excelsius. I've heard varying things, so I don't want to tell you an assumption at this point. So let's find out from SAP and see what they'll tell us.
All right, totally. Well, thanks so much. Make sure, fill in the survey at the end. Let us know how Jonathan can get better. I mean, me. Clearly, he's got this thing down pat. Thanks so much, y'all. We'll see you at the next time.